In the 1960s and 70s, South Korea sent about 20,000 miners and nurses to Germany as a form of human collateral. And in return, Seoul received loans to rebuild an economy devastated by the Korean War. Well, some of these Korean workers returned after their 3-year contracts ended, but many never came back home. CNA senior correspondent Lim Yun-suk traces their journey across Korea and Germany.
Martin Hyun visits his father whenever he can in Krefeld, Germany. The words, "I love you, rest in peace," are carved in Korean, the language of his father, Hyun Woo-soo's birthplace. Hyun Woo-soo came to West Germany in 1970 as a coal miner on a 3-year contract. He never went back. After the Korean War halted in 1953, South Korea rebuilt itself with the help of foreign loans from countries such as Germany. In return, it sent about 8,000 young men deep into Germany's coal mines. More than 11,000 South Korean women filled a shortage of nurses.
우리는 그 담보로서 차관을 빌리기 위해서 담보로 갔잖아요. 한국 경력도 없는데 이게 석탄이로 얼굴 막 문지르 새까맣게 몸 무게도 60kg가 넘었어야 돼 기본. 그때는 뭐 먹어갖고 60kg 넘은 사람 별로 없었습니다. 소금 먹고 계란 먹고 물 먹고 배를 꽝꽝하게 채가지고 심지검사 끝난과 동시에 화장실 가서 토하고 다 흘렀대요.
Park Ching-gu spent 25 years underground, leaving him with chronic back injuries. He is now dependent on medical coverage that would end if he leaves Germany.
그분들이 일을 많이 해가지고 많이 망가지고 그랬죠. 원하는 건 사실 뭐 솔직히 얘기하면 한국 가고 싶은 거예요. 반평생 여기서 살았으니까 비행기표는 항상 뭐 여기서 해결이 된다고 해도 한국 가면 내가 거주할 데가 없잖아요. 그 남은 인생 한국 가서 살고 싶다는 그게 원하는 거예요.
The nurses carried the same burden, sending almost everything they earned back home. Lee Mok-jin worked as a nurse in Berlin for nearly a decade before returning to South Korea.
첫 번 성공할 때 68,000원 정도 이렇게 보낸 거예요. 그거를 모아서 아버지가 집을 몇 번 샀어요. 처음에는 이제 부모님 집을 다 이제 샀었고, 그 다음에는 이제 오빠네 집을 샀었고.
Among those who came back to South Korea when the contracts ended, a handful built homes in a German village, a hilltop community in the southern coastal county of Namhae. About 40 families now live here, and it has become a tourist attraction. The relationship between South Korea and Germany goes back nearly 70 years to a time when West Germany faced a labor shortage and South Korea sent its young people here to work. What began as a transaction became something more permanent. Many left believing Germany was temporary. It became the place they would grow old. Before Hyun Woo-soo died last year, he recorded his life story in German and Korean, the two languages of his existence.
첫 달 봉급을 타갖고 제일 먼저 엄마 생활비부터 먼저 보냈어요. 엄마 밥 굶지 말고 집에 잘 있거래. 나 엄마한테 돈 보내줄 테니까 엄마 걱정하지 말고 집에 잘 있으라고.
They gave everything to help rebuild a country whose story many younger Koreans barely know.
And for more insights, we are again joined by CNA senior correspondent Lim Yun-suk live from Andong in South Korea, a separate location, no doubt from where she was earlier. Really heartbreaking stories we heard there, Yun-suk, really moving as well. I'd imagine the conditions were quite grim for some of these workers in Germany.
Well, yes, it was. And I think it was very different for the miners and the nurses, because for the miners, the conditions were extremely dangerous. And that's actually one of the reasons why West Germany had to recruit so-called foreign guest workers in the first place, because many German workers no longer wanted to go underground because the work was so risky. But, for the South Koreans at the time, the wages were apparently very, very attractive. Some former workers told us that the miners were earning about 10 times or even more what a civil servant made in South Korea in the 1960s. And so when recruitment drives opened, the applications outnumbered the available spots. And remember, these men, they had no training experience, no mining experience, though that was the requirement. And so for most of them, the work was exhausting, physical labor, going underground, long hours, the heat, dust, and constant safety risks. But it was better than staying in South Korea, they said, where it was still trying to recover from the ashes of the Korean War. And in fact, one miner told his son, Martin Hyun, that we saw in the story, about what life was like back then here in South Korea. So let's hear what Martin said.
You cannot understand the hunger that they experienced during that time. But I understood when he said he went to the army and the recruiter said, "You are so young, why do you want to come? Why do you want to join? You're still young, come at a later time." And he said, I came here because I'm hungry, I have hunger. And the army served, I guess, three meals a day. And then I fully realized what he went through.
And so it wasn't just for, him, but it was really for a lot of the miners, that the poverty that really pushed them to go to Germany. But for the nurses, the hardship was different. I mean, several described the hospitals as being, like a battlefield because they were just so busy and understaffed. But many of them were telling me that they were treated warmly by the German colleagues, the supervisors, and especially the patients, who sometimes call them diamonds and angels. And, it was those kind of relationships that helped them endure the loneliness and this culture shock. Though, the loneliness and being thousands of miles away from families were felt every day by the nurses, too. And in fact, Martin Hyun's mother was a nurse there, too. And this is what she said.
집이 생각날 때는 사진을 항상 안고 잤어요. 가슴에다 안고. 남한테 눈물 안 보이려고 혼자서 가서 그러고.
And, hearing the stories from the miners and the nurses, I really realized that behind South Korea's economic rise and what South Korea is now, looking like to the world, there were these deep personal sacrifices made from home.
Yeah, Yoon Suk, and I'm glad that you did this story because it brings awareness to those in South Korea who might not know that there is this generation of people who went through that. But help us understand this, though, because the contracts were just there for 3 years. And yet, some ended up building their lives in Germany, thriving, but there were also others who, decided to return. So what was some of the grounds for that?
Well, yes, when they first went, they all went on this 3-year contract, and most initially said that they saw Germany as being temporary and that they were going to come back home. But in the end, roughly 2/3 returned to South Korea, or they moved elsewhere, like to Canada or the United States, while about 1/3 stayed in Germany permanently. Now, the reasons varied. Some stayed because they wanted to continue supporting their family financially, but there were others who said they met their partners, they got married either to Germans or fellow Korean workers there, and they decided to stay there and raise their families. And so the people kept extending the contracts, and some eventually became German citizens. Some of them were saying that they said, okay, maybe next year I'll go, but they just ended up staying there for decades and now call Germany their home. But staying wasn't easy because, when Germany stopped recruiting guest workers in the 1970s as the economy slowed there, Korean nurses actually protested against those plans to send them home, and eventually they won the right to remain. And many miners also said, they had to reinvent themselves after the mines closed down in Germany. One former miner we spoke to was saying that he took nursing courses so that he could leave the mine after the 3-year contract ended. Then he became a nurse for over 20 years, and now he's a football referee in Germany. So even decades later, some former workers were telling us that they still, struggle with this loneliness and this discrimination or feeling caught between the two countries. And interestingly, there's also many of the former workers who are still in Germany who want to return to South Korea now, but say they simply cannot afford to relocate because this country that, they went to help build has just become so expensive for them to return home.
Yeah, and we heard that in your story earlier, and that's why, I'm curious to know then, is the government doing anything, the Korean government, I'm saying, to help these workers?
Well, that really depends on who you ask or who you talk to, because some of the former miners and nurses were saying that they have repeatedly appealed to the South Korean government for more support, like the welfare assistance for the aging and financially struggling workers who are still living in Germany. Others simply want, greater recognition for the role they played in helping generate this foreign currency during South Korea's early industrialization period. Now, there is this memorial square, which was recently unveiled in Seoul, and we went to cover that, and it honors the miners and nurses, but I was told that the former workers themselves had to fund much of that project. At the same time, not everyone feels resentment. There was this one nurse in Germany who was saying that she was grateful for the lives that she was able to build in Germany because it was an opportunity for many of the women to get out of South Korea, especially because South Korea at the time were, favoring sons more than daughters. And so they don't necessarily believe that the South Korean government owed them anything. So, there was this real mix of pride, disappointment, and also complicated emotion within that generation that we spoke to.
We are running out of time, but very quickly, Yoon-soo, tell us more about this German village in South Korea where some of these former miners and nurses have moved to. Tell us more about it.
Well, yes, it's called Namhae. It's a beautiful coastline village. It was proposed to be a retirement community for the former miners and nurses returning from Germany. And the idea is to create an environment so that they could come back, still live the way that they did back in Germany. And, the residents invested heavily themselves. Even for this, they imported a lot of the German building materials, designed homes according to strict German-style guidelines that were given by Namhae County. But many of the residents there said that many of the promises they were given were not kept. And in fact, one resident said that they feel as if they were being used, as a bait to turn this place into a tourist attraction. And it is right now as a huge tourist attraction. But the miners and nurses say they just feel that, they want recognition. They're hoping that the younger generation won't forget them and they'll be remembered for a long time.
Oh, I sure hope so. It's a very important story that you did. And thanks so much for sharing, Yoon-suk. CNA Senior Correspondent Lim Yoon-suk, live from Andong in South Korea.